Good afternoon, students. Today is Friday, 9 April 2021. This will be our second lecture of this week. After today, we have, I believe, 7 more lectures. This is the second of 3 days on the essay by David Shaw on cryonics. And just a quick reminder, I'm going to remind you of this every time we meet from now on. The third and final exam is on the 11th of May, so make sure you get that on your calendar and ensure that nothing comes up to conflict with it. Okay, we're working our way through the various arguments that David Shaw thinks up and responds to. Here is the handout I referred to the other day. It shows all of the arguments that are discussed in Shaw's essay. You can see that there are 4 boxes here, here, 2, and then down here, and then here. There are 4 boxes, and you can see how they're divided up. There are ethical arguments in favor of cryonics. There are ethical arguments against cryonics. There are prudential arguments for cryonics, and there are prudential arguments against cryonics. You can see that we're currently looking at the category entitled Prudential Arguments Against Cryonics. There are 7 arguments listed in there. I don't discuss all of them in my notes, but I do discuss most of them. So I'm trying to be thorough. This handout incorporates all the arguments that I could spot in the essay. Okay, so this will help you follow along. Make sure you have your copy of Shaw handy, so if I read from it, you can follow along. I should say that this essay is probably too long for just 2 class periods, but not long enough for 3. So I divided it up into 3 chunks. Today's lecture will probably not go for very long. I want to leave something to discuss for next week on the 3rd lecture. So what have we done so far? We're currently looking at prudential arguments against cryonics. And we've examined 2 of those arguments so far. I call them the loneliness argument and the expense argument. The first argument says you shouldn't undergo cryonic preservation because you'll be lonely. If and when you are brought back to life, you'll be lonely because your family and friends will not be there with you. And Shaw responds to that. He says, for example, there's no reason your family and friends can't undergo cryonic preservation, and all of you can be brought back to life at the same time, so you can resume your friendships and your family connections. The expense argument appeals to people's financial well-being. It says cryonic preservation is expensive, and that's a reason not to undergo it. Notice it's not an ethical reason per se, it's a prudential reason. It says it's not really in your long-term best interest to be spending money on cryonic preservation when you have other needs and other interests. And again, Shaw responds to that argument. So let's pick up with a new argument now. I have 3 more arguments to discuss with you in this same category, prudential arguments against cryonics, and then we'll turn to ethical objections to cryonics. Okay, and we'll cover a couple of those before we break off for the day. So here is the next argument, the 3rd one that we have discussed so far. And I'm going to quote Shaw from page 516. I call this the argument from inadequate technology. Here's how he puts it. The technology is unproven. In fact, it is not only unproven, it does not yet exist. Although current science allows us to freeze bodies, the technology has not yet been invented that would allow thawing without severe tissue damage, unquote. And he also adds, investing in cryonics is like throwing money away. So it's not only spending money that you could use for other purposes, which was the expense argument. This one is that you're simply wasting money because, specifically, the technology is not yet proven. In fact, the freezing technology does exist. The thawing and reviving technology does not currently exist, although I assure you, Alcor and other corporations are working on it, trying to develop techniques that can revive frozen bodies and brains. Now, what can be said in response to this argument that in effect you're throwing money away? Here are the objections that, or I'm sorry, the replies that Shaw comes up with. First, he says the money will be no good to me anyway once I'm dead, so why not spend it on something that will at least offer a slim chance of life after death? So the old saying is you can't take it with you. When you die, any money that you've accumulated will be of no use to you. So this argument says you're throwing money away. Shaw says, well, I won't have that money. I won't have any use for that money once I'm dead anyway. So why not take a chance that I can put that money to use and revive myself at some future point? Secondly, there are three replies. Here's the second one. Shaw says, the technology, quote, is certainly within the realm of theoretical possibility, unquote. So we may not have worked out in practice how to thaw and revive bodies, but theoretically it's possible. And so the only question is to bring theory and practice together. And that's just going to take some time. It's going to take experimentation, trial and error, and the hope is that eventually this technique will be perfected and techniques for thawing bodies and reviving them will exist. In fact, Shaw points out that embryos, human embryos in animals, have been frozen successfully already. So whether the technology will exist to thaw them and revive them remains to be seen. The third reply that Shaw makes to this argument is this. It's from page 517. He says, the necessary advances need not occur in the next century or so. In other words, what's the rush? Maybe the technology doesn't exist today, but it doesn't need to. People are freezing their bodies today. They're not going to want them thawed out and revived until much later. And maybe by then the technology will have been perfected. It will have been worked out so that thawing and reviving is a possibility. Again, what's the rush? We don't need the technology now. All we need now is freezing technology. What we need later will be thawing and reviving technology. And who's to say that won't come about? Now, if you're following along in my lecture notes, you'll see I'm at the bottom of page 2. And I thought of a more powerful argument. Actually, Shaw thought of it. And here it is. The technology, quote, might become available, but remain so expensive that the initial payment to the cryonics company remains insufficient for revival. So that's a problem for the prospective cryonaut. The problem is that even if the technology becomes available at some future point, it will be prohibitively expensive. So expensive that the company will not be able to make a profit on using that technology to revive the people it has frozen. And the company could actually go out of business. If expenses become so great that the company can't make a profit, the company may file for bankruptcy and may eventually go out of business. And when that occurs, all of the frozen bodies and brains will, of course, be thawed out and not revived. So the grand experiment will be over at that point. So anybody who undertakes this technology is taking a risk. You must be assuming that the company will stay financially viable for many, many decades, if not centuries. And if you ask yourself, how many American companies today are more than 1 century old? Most of the companies, like Standard Oil, have gone out of business long ago. Some companies have been around for several decades. Microsoft, for example, I think was founded in the 1970s, so it's approaching half a century. But will there be a Microsoft 50 years from now or 100 years from now? Who's to say? So when you invest your money in a company like Alcor in the hope that you will one day be revived, you are taking a big gamble that the company will still be in existence then. Also, as Shaw points out, governments may decide not to allow thawing and reviving. Governments of the future may decide, for example, that it's unethical to bring people back to life. Maybe there will be worldwide poverty, and governments may decide that it's better to attend to the needs of those who are now living in poverty than to bring back into existence people who had their bodies frozen centuries ago, for example. Maybe the government will decree that it's too expensive and that the money can better be used elsewhere for other purposes. So there's a lot of risk involved. Not only that the company may go out of business, but that governments may dissolve the company or prohibit bringing people back to life, in which case your investment was for naught. It was a waste of your money. Now, you wouldn't have known that at the time you entered into the contract with Alcor or whatever other company you contract with, but it could turn out that it was a waste of money because the government, either the company goes out of business or the government prevents them by law from thawing and reviving people. Okay, two more objections. Two more arguments against cryonics. Both of them are prudential. The next one is what I call pointlessness, or we might call it the pointlessness argument. Shaw puts it like this on page 517. He says, it is possible that people will find themselves revived with the same pathology that killed them, unquote. Now, if that were true, if you, for example, died of a particular disease and were thawed out and revived in the future when there's no cure for that disease, then you are out of luck because you still have the disease pathogen and it's going to cause your death again, presumably. So what's the point? That's why I call this the pointlessness argument. Well, the reply to this argument is as follows. According to Shaw, it seems likely that cures for most pathologies will have been found by the time revival becomes technologically feasible. So that's the first point, right? Depending on how much time passes between freezing and thawing, there's a good chance that the world will now have a cure for whatever killed you. And so when you're revived, the cure will be ready to apply to stave off the disease that killed you. Also, the company may simply decide not to thaw you out until there is a cure. So suppose you died from disease X, we'll just call it X. The company will make a note of that in your record, and obviously there will be no point in reviving you unless there is currently a cure for X. You see? So some people will be thawed out when there's a cure for their diseases, and others will be kept in the state of suspended animation, awaiting a cure. It could be several more centuries before a particular disease like cancer is cured. So while this is an argument against cryonics, it may not be a very strong argument. Shaw suggests that there's a good reply to this argument. Okay, or a couple of good replies. And finally, this is the last prudential argument against cryonics. Boredom, or we might call it the boredom argument. Shaw says this on page 517. If it is successful and does lead to immortality, then the classic objection to eternal life comes into play. People might become bored with life. So remember, these are arguments directed to people who are thinking about having their bodies frozen. Think of a friend arguing against this procedure, trying to persuade you not to undergo the procedure. The friend says to you, you'll get bored, even if it works. And the chances of it working are maybe quite small, but even if we assume the best, that you are eventually thawed and revived, and whatever disease you died from is cured, you're going to live forever. And you're going to get bored with life. Now, this is a general argument that you sometimes hear in philosophy. It's an argument against the desire for immortality. The argument is that endless life would be boring. Now, maybe some amount of life beyond what we have naturally would be appreciated, but what if you literally had an endless life? What if you could live not just 100 additional years, but 200 more years, or 300, or 400? Wouldn't there come a point, you think, where whatever gives your life meaning, whatever activities you undertake that are enjoyable to you, that they just get boring after a while, and you'd rather be dead than continue getting up every day and doing the same things, even if they're pleasant? Now, this is a general argument against immortality. There are people, philosophers, for example, who have argued that they don't want to be immortal for this reason. They don't want to live a life of utter boredom and repetition. So the idea is, take advantage of the natural lifespan that you have, whatever it may be. Try to pack as much pleasantry into it as you can. And when the time comes to die a natural death, accept it and allow your life to end. Okay, go back to Hardwick's essay. He was in effect saying that when you become a burden to others, your family members and friends, you should think seriously about taking steps to bring about your death. And that's a good reason to make sure you live every day so as not to waste it. If you believe that you have only 75 years of life, it will motivate you to make every one of those days of your life pay, right? Make every day enjoyable and be productive, so that when you reach the age of 75 or 80, you will have no regrets when death comes to your door, so to speak. So what does Shaw say in response to the boredom argument? He makes a couple of points. Number one, he says suicide is always an option. So suppose you've become revived in the distant future, and you've lived another couple of centuries, and you get bored. You can always kill yourself, find a way to end your life. And that means it will be over for good, assuming you don't undertake any more cryonic preservation. Kill yourself, stipulate that your body be cremated, for example, and then there would be no future boredom for you. So you always have it within your power to end a boring life. It reminds me of that scene in Wizard of Oz when the good witch tells Dorothy near the end of the movie, you always had it in your power to go back to Kansas. You just didn't know it. Well, that's what's being said here. If you ever get bored, you always have it in your power to end that boredom by killing yourself. Okay? So that's the first reply Shaw makes to this argument. The second one is that immortality will presumably be available to everyone by the time you are revivable. And that means everyone is going to have the same boredom problem, right? So what Shaw seems to be saying here is that this argument, this boredom argument, is not an argument against cryonics in particular. It's an argument against immortality in general, right? And so this can't be chalked up as an argument specifically against cryonics. It's a general objection to living forever. Okay, you still with me? So what we've done now is we've looked at a number of arguments in this category on the diagram right here. Okay, looked at a number of arguments. We're going to move on now to ethical arguments. See the column? These are ethical arguments, and we're going to look specifically at ethical arguments against cryonics, which is this category down here in the southwestern quadrant of the diagram. And you can see I've got 5 arguments listed in there. So let's just go over the first couple, and when we meet again next week, we'll finish up the ethical arguments against cryonics, first thing, and then we'll turn to what Shaw calls prudential and ethical arguments in favor of cryonics. And he has this interesting thing called the cryonic wager, which is analogous to Pascal's wager. And I'll explain all that on the third lecture next week. So let's just get started on the ethical objections, and then we'll break off for the day. These arguments, according to Shaw, are different from the prudential arguments. Those were directed to people's self-interest. What they said is you shouldn't undergo cryonics because it's not in your long-term rational self-interest. This new kind of argument is ethical. It says you shouldn't undergo cryonics because of its bad effects on other people besides yourself. That's what makes it an ethical or moral argument, because your actions have effects on others. Isn't that what Hardwigg was trying to teach us? Hardwigg said that this ethics of fantasy is just that, fantasy. We imagine ourselves being isolated from everyone else, and therefore when we make decisions, they affect no one but ourselves. But Hardwigg says that's a fantasy because in reality, we're all connected in many ways to many other people. And when our actions start to affect those other people adversely, then we have moral obligations to them. Hardwigg concluded that we have a moral obligation to end our lives because our actions have become a burden, because our existence has become a burden to others. So these are now ethical arguments, and it's as though someone were saying to the prospective cryonaut, it would be wrong for you to undergo cryonic preservation for the following reason or reasons. And there are multiple arguments that have that form. Here's the first one. The first argument says it's bad for the environment. Right? Cryonic preservation is bad for the environment. Now you might say, well, the environment is not a person, so why should I care? But the environment is important not only for its own sake, but it's important because the environment is the habitat for other people and other species. So if you're doing things that are bad for the environment directly, then indirectly you're doing things that are bad for other people and other animals. Okay, so that's why this is an ethical argument. And if you happen to believe that the environment itself has interests and that what we do can have good and bad effects on the environment, then that's just an additional reason, ethical reason. Okay? So let's take a look at this argument. On page 517 of his essay, Shaw says, quote, opting for cryonic storage would be bad for the environment. Why specifically? Because resources must be used to keep the body frozen. I alluded to this argument the other day when I told you how hot it is in Scottsdale, Arizona. And the facility there that keeps these bodies at a very, very low temperature is obviously using a lot of electricity. Now you may think, well, big deal, that's what electricity is for. But where does electricity come from? It comes from various places, hydroelectric dams, wind farms, but also the burning of coal, which is a pollutant. So arguably, preserving bodies at these very low temperatures requires the burning of coal and maybe other fossil fuels, and that is destructive of the environment. So this argument appeals to people who care about the environment either for its own sake or because other people depend on a clean, healthy environment for their well-being. Now, what can be said in response to this argument? Here's the first objection, or the first reply Shaw makes. He says burial and cremation, which are the main alternatives to cryopreservation, are also bad for the environment. Okay, so burial takes up scarce land. When every human is buried, it takes up a certain amount of land forever, or for as long as the cemetery is maintained. So that's to some extent destructive of the environment, burial of remains. And what about cremation? Cremation means burning, burning up the bodies. And of course, whenever you're burning something, you are polluting or risking pollution. And that's not good for the environment either. So the first thing that Shaw points out is even, he sounds like he's conceding that cryopreservation has bad effects on the environment. He's saying, but so do other means of bodily disposal, such as burial and cremation. So cryopreservation isn't uniquely bad for the environment. It's among many ways of disposing of bodies that are bad for the environment. And he then makes an interesting point that somewhat undermines his first point. He says, really, when you think about it, cryonics isn't bodily disposal. So it really shouldn't be lumped in with burial and cremation, right? Cryonic preservation isn't a means of disposing of a body, it's a means of preserving a body in the hope that it will one day be thawed and revived. Okay, so those are the two responses that Shaw makes. He does mention in passing something you've probably never heard of. It's called promession. Promession, Promession. And promession is a technique that's not perfected, but there's hope of one day perfecting it. Promession involves freezing the body and then breaking it up into little pieces. And those little pieces could then presumably be scattered on the ground somewhere. And since it's biodegradable, it will become part of the earth again. You may be wondering, well, how does that differ from cremation, where the ashes can be scattered on the ground? Well, cremation is fire. It's burning, and that creates pollution. Freezing these bodies and then breaking them up into little pieces, biodegradable pieces, does not involve burning them. So it's better for the environment, supposedly. Promession is better for the environment than either burial or cremation. The problem is promession has not yet been worked out in practice. It's a dream or a hope at this point. And you can look it up. I looked it up on Wikipedia this morning just to learn more about it. And I didn't find a lot there, but it sounds as though this technique is not yet being implemented. And maybe one day it will. We'll have to wait and see. But Shaw does mention it. It's called promession. Okay, one more argument and we'll be done for the day. This one is the selfishness argument. The argument is that, as you can guess with a name like that cryonic preservation is selfish. And selfishness is a loaded term. To be selfish means to put your own personal interests ahead of more important interests of others. And that's why we think that selfish people are bad people to that extent. Selfishness is a bad character trait, right? It's not good to be selfish. We tell our children, don't be selfish. Share what you have with others. Care more about other people. Don't focus just on yourself and your own feelings. Think about other people and how your actions affect them. So here's how Shaw puts it. This argument now is on page 518. It is unethical to spend one's life insurance on cryonic storage rather than on one's children, family, and friends, or on charity. So notice we've got a series of concentric circles. There's the person, the cryonaut, or prospective cryonaut, and then there's the prospective cryonaut's immediate family, including children, and then extended family, and then friends, and eventually strangers, acquaintances, and then strangers. So charity involves giving of yourself for the benefit of others, including strangers, people who are suffering or in need, who can be helped by your actions or efforts. So the argument says you shouldn't devote resources to this vain hope of having your life extended through cryopreservation Instead, you should use that money, whatever it will be, use that sum of money to help other people who are here, who already exist, who are in need. It could be your family or friends, but maybe also strangers. After all, it's likely that you and your family and friends are doing better than many other people in the world today who are suffering for lack of basic necessities: food, fuel, shelter, clothing, medical care. So you can do more good in the world by giving resources to those people rather than giving them to your own family and friends. And certainly you can do more good by giving your resources to the poor than you can by investing it in cryopreservation, which has not been proven, which may never work, and which may end up being a waste of resources. So that's the argument. The argument is you shouldn't be selfish, and you would be being selfish if you underwent this cryopreservation procedure. Here are Shaw's replies to that argument. He says, first of all, that whether cryonics is selfish depends on whether it works. Well, that's an interesting point. Look, either cryonics ends up working or it doesn't. If it ends up working, then why is it selfish for you to, in effect, purchase additional years of life? That's not necessarily selfish, wanting to live more. I mean, do we ordinarily accuse people of being selfish because they want to live an additional year or 5 years or 10 years? Perhaps not. Now, what about the other alternative? If cryonics ends up not working, then looking back, you might say, yes, it was selfish to invest the money. The problem is we don't know now whether it will end up working or not working. So how can we accuse people of being selfish now when we don't even know whether cryonic preservation works? Right? If it ends up working, then clearly it wasn't a selfish decision. The second thing that Shaw says about this argument is, quote, cryonics is at worst merely a failure of altruism. It is probably not even that. For who could argue that altruism demands that one die earlier than one otherwise could? Now that connects up to the points I was just making. Altruism, by the way, typically means sacrificing yourself for others, or giving of yourself for the sake of others. And people like that are called altruistic. It's the opposite of selfishness. So when I'm selfish, I'm focused only on myself. When I'm altruistic, I'm focused on others, maybe at the neglect of myself. Maybe I'm sacrificing my own interests for the sake of other more needy people. And those are the true altruists out there. And there are people like that, people who donate kidneys to a stranger, someone they don't even know and may never meet. When you donate a kidney, of course you have two. If you donate a kidney, you may still be able to live and function, but you're at greater risk now, because if your only remaining kidney goes bad, so to speak, then you may yourself find yourself in need of a kidney donor. And yet there are people who donate a kidney to strangers. That's altruistic. That's a form of altruism. So what Shaw seems to be saying is, if you forego the opportunity to have your body frozen in the hope of revival in the future, at the very most we can say that you fail to be altruistic. And it would be unfair and inaccurate to say that you're being selfish. Right? You're simply hoping for additional additional years of life. Okay? It might be a failure of altruism, but it's not, therefore, selfish. You see the difference? Okay, and I have a query here. You'll notice if you're looking at my notes on page 3, I said, mightn't a lawyer for the insurance company demand the proceeds back on the ground that the insured isn't dead? Remember, one way to pay for this procedure is through life insurance proceeds. So up until now, we've been assuming the following, that when you die, the life insurance policy that you have paid for will pay the proceeds to your beneficiary, and we were assuming that it would be Alcor or some company like Alcor. Okay, so you die, Alcor swoops in, freezes your body, and takes the money from your insurance policy. Now, insurance companies don't exist to give away money. They have a team of lawyers, and they make sure that when they pay out on an insurance policy, they have to make sure that all the terms of the contract are complied with. And obviously, an insurance company that sells life insurance policies won't pay out the proceeds unless you are dead, right? Only when you die do the proceeds get paid to the beneficiary. Well, it sounds now as though the proponent of cryopreservation is saying, I'm not really dead yet. I'm only in a state of suspended animation, waiting for revival at some future point. Can you just imagine the attorney for the insurance company saying, whoa, wait a minute. You're saying you're not dead, you're just in a state of suspended animation? Well, then we're not paying insurance proceeds, right? Under the contract, we're not to pay those proceeds until you die. And you yourself are saying, I'm not dead, I'm just in a state of suspension, waiting to be thawed and reanimated. So Shaw doesn't mention this, but I thought of it. It's a potential problem for this whole practice of cryopreservation, especially when you use your life insurance to pay for the freezing and the preservation. All right, well, we're only 36 minutes into the lecture, but again, this is one of those essays that I think we need more than 2 days, but probably not 3. So I chose 3, knowing that the 3 lectures would be fairly short. So why don't we finish things up next week when we meet again? And I'm thinking for your class, I'm thinking your 2 lectures next week will be Wednesday and Friday. But again, I'll send you an email whenever they're put up, so you don't have to waste your time checking. But I'm thinking Wednesday. And when we meet again Wednesday, or whichever day it turns out to be, we will finish up the rest of this article. We're going to look at more arguments, ethical arguments against cryonics, the organ squandering argument, the meaning of death argument, and the slippery slope argument. And then we're going to turn to the final section of the essay entitled Arguments in Favor of Cryonics. In fact, one of the arguments that is listed on here that Shaw doesn't really talk much about is this one right here. Ethical arguments in favor of cryonics. And you'll see there's only one argument in that box. It says cryonauts may benefit future societies. So that's an ethical argument because it says that this procedure may end up helping other people rather than harming them. So that's what makes it ethical. And what makes it an ethical argument in favor of cryonics is that you will be doing good rather than harm by having your body frozen. I mean, just imagine, suppose you have your body frozen and you are revived 500 years from now. You may have skills that are of use to the society 500 years from now, skills that they have lost somehow. Maybe there's been a nuclear catastrophe and people are living very differently 500 years from now than they are now. You may have skills that will be of great use to them. Okay, and that's got to be counted in favor of cryopreservation. You're a good doer in the future. Not a do-gooder, but a good doer. Okay? So this handout is designed to help you keep track of the arguments. When we meet again next week, the first lecture, we will finish up Shaw. Now, what are we going to do for the second lecture next week? If you look at the reading list for the course, you'll see the next item is an essay by John Hospers entitled What Libertarianism Is. And we're going to spend only 1 day on that, maybe a day and a half. And the reason I put this in the course is because the essay following Hospers is by a libertarian philosopher named John, how's he pronounce it? Jan Narveson. No, wait, I think he pronounced it Jan Narveson. Sorry about that. So anyway, Jan Narveson is a libertarian, and he is going to argue that there is no right to health care. No right to health care. And he's going to argue for that on libertarian grounds, using libertarian principles. So I decided that we're going to spend 1 or 1.5 days discussing libertarianism in general before we look at Narveson's article in particular. So we're going to spend a total of 3 days on this topic, and it'll be divided up about 1 day for Hospers and 2 for Narveson. Maybe a day and a half on each. We'll see how it goes. Okay, and I'll get Hospers posted over the weekend. If you want to get ahead in your reading, I'll post the essay by John Hospers so you can start reading the essay entitled What Libertarianism Is. Okay, have a great day and a great weekend. I'll see you on the computer screen next week, probably on Wednesday.